here in town, and I also teach in the School of Religion at Ottawa University. And I just taught a course on world religions, and we do a broad overview of major religions at an embarrassingly thin level, but then also talk about the need for civility in the midst of religious pluralism. And so the question I wrote down for you was wondering if you could say, the students that I teach are predominantly don't come from a very religious background, and if they do, it's a pretty conservative, sometimes fundamentalist, sometimes not evangelical background. So my question is, if there was one thing you would want that population of kids, of students, to know about Islam, what should I be communicating to them? And if there was one principle or one thought about religious pluralism that you would want stressed?
Great question. Great. There's a number of thinkers coming out of evangelical circles who have had reason to be in conversation with Muslims. And so there's actually a number of pieces that are out there, very, very thoughtful pieces, from an emic perspective about how to relate to the religious other. Then there's a whole interesting literature online and in print about essentially how to convert Muslims, right? Muslims have that about Christians as well, so it's equal opportunity. But there's so much of a shared heritage, and I think that sometimes the communities don't necessarily, and specifically, Muslim communities oftentimes know a bit more about Christian communities because obviously in the West they've had to understand how to navigate the society here. But even in Muslim majority places, because there's often strong Christian minority communities in those spaces, and because there's been hundreds of years of just natural intermingling, there's been a lot more exposure, right? So I find that it's very particular to the US context, where you have large groups of very committed Christians who know virtually nothing about Islam. And the biblical figures, I think, are one of the ways in, and sometimes there's many similarities in stories, and I'll talk about this on Saturday, and then there's some pronounced differences too. And it's always that question of how we balance similarities and differences, for instance. And so if I would think about one figure, or what can we boil this down to? The role of Jesus, Isa in Arabic, and then we say peace be upon him. The role of Jesus is absolutely fascinating in Islam because it almost totally mirrors what you would find in a Christian context, except being non-Trinitarian, and so Jesus is a prophet, but Word of God, and incarnation is really interesting because the Quran talks about Jesus as kalimatullah, like the divine word, given flesh. I mean, that is the logos. That is the utter. This is the essence of the earliest Christianities, right? So, there's. Jesus represents simultaneously the biggest difference between Trinitarian Christianity and Islam, but also the biggest similarity at the same time. So that's understanding the role that Jesus plays for Muslims, I think, can really start to just open out. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was curious to.
I just saw a question brewing in someone. I thought I might have seen a question brewing in someone's face. Sometimes I get that wrong, but that's the teacher instinct in me. Is like that's a question face. Go ahead.
I was kind of curious your comments early on about the development of teaching, interfaith relationships, and all that stuff. As an undergraduate in the 1970s, studied at a major secular university in California, and it struck me that the faculty there teaching the non-Western, non-Christian tend to be Christian missionaries who returned, having developed a wonderful honor, respect, and love for the culture and the religions that we're talking about. But as I was finishing, I'm beginning to get some younger scholars in there, but they're still predominantly European, American types and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to two things. One, tell you it's now time to drink the water.
Yes. Are you sure though? Wait, 36?
No,
What?
I think he's
36, unless I got the sunset wrong.
Okay.
Okay, almost, it is almost time, that's good news.
We were talking about that in the airport, we're coming in from the airport, it's just the water right there in front of you is for you. But secondly, how do you see the difference in development of younger scholars in the field of religious studies?
Yeah, this is a great question because the Academy has given so many resources to the study of religion that have come out of this idea of the detached observer, right? There's certain ways in which that produces a kind of knowing, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And I think that's where religious studies as a field has finally come around to seeing, is that emic perspectives can be quite useful. And so there's a major, religious studies is actually still a pretty big field, despite it's probably the field that's maybe in the most decline of the humanities. It's still fairly large. And across campuses, across these major, the American Academy of Religion, for instance, these major events, I see that decolonizing perspectives are very front and center. Of course, feminist perspectives have always been closely, well not always been, but for decades now have been closely linked with thinking through relationships of power and privilege, including colonial and post-colonial relationships. So I think religious studies is at this really fascinating nexus where it's now has a few centuries of, at least in the field of Islamic studies and others more orientalizing scholarship that has nonetheless produced a pretty incredible body of work, some of it accurate, some of it not, but combining this with these perspectives that are coming out from people who belong to the communities that they are studying. There's a whole research methodology for best practices around this, or ways of stepping in and out of a confessional identity and an academic identity, which is a lot of what I do in my own approaches. So I think it's absolutely exciting for the field of religious studies, and the field has also become much more interdisciplinary as well. It's a field of mixed methodology to begin with, but more and more scholars have deep backgrounds in how to do really responsible ethnography, and they also have great resources for how to do discourse analysis using kind of computer models or something. So the digital humanities is another exciting layer of what's happening. More and more we've been able to less look at traditions as these blocks where there is an authorized mainstream perspective that we're interested in, and we're not interested in the edges, the margins, the fringes, the ultra-righty, we could say, within the tradition. So they've become more spaces where the margins can have an interesting role to play in terms of academic studies. So oftentimes now the studies that decenter the authorizing narratives are the ones that are actually getting a lot of traction, getting the funding, etc. There is a danger that we swing the other direction and forget that there is a mainstream kind of core to communities, and that it is still very, very powerful and does have an authorizing presence. But I am also very invigorated. I think about a monograph that just came out in the European context, looking at a Danish women's mosque that, the whole ethnography is based on this Danish women's mosque and the people who come in and out of this mosque. And so that's very much on the fringes of the Islamic tradition, having a female imam, it's a non-Muslim majority location, drawing on a really diverse group of informants. So these kinds of studies have become more and more the norm of what's possible. So it's moving away from that ethnographers did their thing in the Department of Anthropology and maybe talked to religionists who were doing more text studies, into a much more dynamic space over the last 15 or so years.
I just have so much going on in my mind. I became exhausted in body, and my spirit is just now taken over. I'm very excited. So I wanted to ask you, since I'm not involved in the academic studies. I have a master's degree and all that kind of stuff. And I grew up related to Haskell. My undergraduate studies was under Rabbi Margulies. My graduate studies in Islam, and have always been, as a radio person, trying to bring to the middle of the road folks the understanding, so we can, as scholars and intellectual people and people of good faith, we can come together and look at the methodologies, and it's so important and very exciting. But then I've got to find a way to bring it home
Exactly.
to the regular folks who are overwhelmed by all that. They're not going to admit to it, and I don't need them to. But just to have the conversation. So I really loved what you talked about. I am getting to the question, I promise. I really loved what you talked about, participating in when appropriate and trying to get people to do that openly. And like, we're headed to Passover, and I'm thinking about maybe we can make it to Ramadan. But being able to take those, how do we do this? That's my question. How do we, how do we bring it home? So we can do podcasts, and we can do events. We can do so that's what I'm doing. I'm doing events, bringing it home to a congregation, and instead of having the interfaith dialogue, which is great, but it's been done over and over again, rather having the people of that faith just come and having moderator ask them questions. You got any other ideas? Because I really am trying to get to the middle of the road folks.
Yeah, public radio has been great about
But only certain
reaching
people
into,
listen
exactly,
to
you have
public
to be,
radio,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. What are how to not preach to the choir, how to expand the interest. So when I was walking through the Haskell Library today, I did see comics, the kind of like native authored comics. So I think continuing to think about what are the modalities in which we can reach, and how then do we get. And I don't watch a lot of Netflix, but people tell me that there's a number of shows these days with Muslim characters on them, and so that certainly reaches in. And so I've had people ask me about Rami. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, okay. Yes, and in some ways the content creators, sometimes they play into the stereotypes, but sometimes they use humor to undo the stereotypes, and sometimes I think TV has been getting, or at least I've seen instances where creators are turning to the communities they want to represent. And so I'll give you the example of Transplant, which is I've watched very little TV, but I did watch this one. It's a story of a Syrian doctor in Canada who is relocated after having experienced a number of traumas in Syria in the war effort. And I know that on that show they communicated with the actual Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS, Syrian American Medical Society. So these are actual doctors who are doing exactly what the lead characters are doing. And then they found that it not only enriched their ability to tell the story accurately, but that feeling, I guess, of being a content creator and putting out something and having the people who you represent saying, this is, I see myself, is a quite, I think, one of the metrics of success. And the show has been wildly, Canadians tend to like TV that has, Muslim characters that are not your terrorist on the plane type. But there's also a content creator I really enjoy, Sakura Nawaz, also Canadian, N-A-W-A, I think it's Z. I'm wondering if I'm now saying her name wrong, but she created a show in collaboration called Little Mosque on the Prairie about the dynamics of the small town mosque. Right? And the point is that people appreciate humor when they see it, and some of the inside jokes you might just get being a Muslim watching the show, but there's enough general humor, that it caters to this broader audience too. So I'm going right away as you're asking this question, what do Americans do more than anything else? They watch TV, right? So that has to be...
Or game.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
gaming
or-
industry.
exactly, that could be a
Okay.
really fascinating
And
space.
music.
Yeah, music too. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
My name is Bobby Francis, and I'm a member of First Presbyterian Church. And on Monday, Thursday, we're having a Seder.
Lovely.
We have a relatively recent in our pastor who came, and she's gotten or given us several unique experiences, and we're having a Seder that night. So it comes to mind that I don't know enough about Islam to know if there is a particular time or event that focuses on your experience as a Muslim that we would be able to hold in
Oh, what a great
contrast to
question.
ours, like the
Yes.
Seder.
So this year, Ramadan moves throughout the year because it's on a lunar
Mhm.
calendar, and that's 11 days shorter than a solar calendar. And so Ramadan moves, and Passover moves in complicated ways that I've tried to understand, and somewhat, Easter's a little bit easier to figure out. But this year is unique in that the holidays are really overlapping, and I'm not sure if that will be the case in subsequent years and for a while. I mean, Ramadan kind of takes about 30 years for Ramadan to move through the calendar cycle. So it is a great opportunity this particular year to think about events where people are naturally oriented around food and company and congregation. So yeah, it could be that the Ramadan iftars, and it's 30 days, so every night pretty much around this time, like the mosque for instance, they'll be kind of rolling out the plastic tarps that go over the prayer mats and getting out the dates and the fruit and getting the meals ready. And so that will be what is taking place now, actually. So people will be, it's customary, it's a good moment, I guess. It's customary when you're fasting to then just say a particular prayer, and you're asking for the divine to accept your fast and to kind of like essentially like open your throat and get your digestive juices going. And Muslims pray for everything, going into the bathroom, out of the bathroom. It's kind of very much prayer is worked in. There's a prayer for nearly everything. So then typically also Muslims will face the Qibla direction. Qibla meaning like the direction of Mecca. Interestingly, the Qibla direction for the first few years of Islam was towards Jerusalem, and then there was a moment where the Qibla direction moved. So much so that in Medina, the mosque that the Prophet Muhammad was praying in, when the Qibla direction was moved, is called the Mosque of the Two Prayer Directions. And you can go there and literally see one niche that shows you where Jerusalem, the direction of Jerusalem, which if you're in Medina, Jerusalem's kind of north and Mecca is sort of south. So the mosque itself has both Qiblas. And in the US, interestingly, some of the really old mosques, they weren't exactly sure whether they should pray kind of over the Pacific Ocean towards Mecca or over the Atlantic Ocean. And so even in the US, you can find old mosques that have two different prayer directions in different ways. But yeah.
Can you just put up again the slide with the two questions at the beginning?
Yes.
I just wanted to write those down. Thank you.
These are just sort of my framing, my eternal framing questions for thinking about interreligious alliances. And I put up here, I don't just use faith, because interfaith, there's many people who I think whose voices I want to have in my life, in my conversations, that wouldn't say they come from a particular faith identity. So I think it's also a moment for interfaith to become wider, and I've been struggling to find language to say condense what this is about, but I've been saying, across faith and philosophical differences, or across metaphysical and ethical priorities, or I just, I've been struggling to find language, but hopefully it'll come to someone. It'll come to someone, and we'll have more inclusive language.
You mentioned that in certain mosques there are different directions for praying.
Very old ones in the
Okay.
US in some places.
What is, I don't know, if there's still conversations around that, which way do people predominantly?
Over the Atlantic is the most common now, although I guess even in California, I'm surprised that over the Atlantic would still be the closest way to America.
I think it's safe to drink.
Oh, thank you,
7:40.
yes, thank you. And most Muslims these days will have an app on the phone, and it'll have a compass. But depending on the building you're in, it can really, really throw off your compass. But there's a verse of the Quran that says, for anywhere you turn, there you find the presence of God. And so what we say, we do our best to try to find the prayer direction, but then wherever you turn, there you find the divine countenance.
Celine, I think we better probably come to a close because it's going to take some time to close up the library, et cetera, and for you to sign some books. It'd be great.
Well, thank you so much. I've been really honored by your presence and your great questions. Maybe we'll see you at other points in the meeting this weekend. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.